At the first rising of the sun, the younger children of Ilúvatar awoke in the land of Hildorian, in the eastward regions of Middle-earth. Hi, this is the Folksy Friend, and on this channel I talk Tolkien lore. I apologize for missing last week. I managed to delete the video and have had to refilm it. So that's what this is. Thanks for putting up with me. I really appreciate 400 subscribers. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know what you think. I read all the comments and I know it takes a while for me to get back, but I really do appreciate it. Okay, onto the video. Today we are talking about the men, and by men I mean humans, but humans are in Tolkien's world known as the race of men, so that includes women and children too. The first men actually awoke upon the rising of the first sun. The elves have been around for thousands of years before the first sunrise, and only now are men finally waking up. The elves in the west knew that men were coming. They had been told and actually manipulated to believe that men were going to be their enemies. Whether or not they still believe that, we shall see. But at this time, elves do know at some point men are going to show up. Men, however, are practically babies. They know nothing. They awoke in the east. No one came to help them. The Valar, the great spirits who had helped the elves when they were young, did not come to help the men, except one. And this one did not actually visit the men in person, but his magic did influence them. Ulmo, Lord of Waters, had always been a little more interested and kind of protective of the men than any of the other Valar. When they awoke, they were drawn to water, and they didn't really know why, but men liked to spend time near streams and rivers and to just listen to the sound of running water. And this was because Ulmo was sending messages and influence through the water with his powers. The men did not understand the messages per se. They weren't like hearing words, but they did feel drawn to these waters, and they did feel a sort of influence of goodness from these sources. The first sentient beings that men meet are the Wild Elves. These are also known as the Avari, or the unwilling, elves who always stayed in the east. They never left to journey across the land. They never went to Valinor. They stayed where they were. And these elves helped them develop a kind of language. So the language spoken by men shared the same root, really, as all elven languages, which will come in handy later when they meet elves in the west who speak very different languages now. From the Avari, men learned a little bit about the Valar, but because the Avari themselves really didn't know much, the only thing that men understood was that there was some sort of great power and great spirits, maybe gods, who knows. There's something powerful in the west. And that was scary to the men. It wasn't like with the majority of the Eldar, the elves who went into the west. They were excited, a little nervous, but excited to meet the Valar. Men were afraid of the idea of these great powerful spirits. Now, the early years for men were relatively safe, more so than the early years for the elves had been, because the sun arose after Morgoth had only just gotten back into Middle-earth. Morgoth was the great evil who despised elves more than anything, and who undoubtedly would come after the men at some point. But he hadn't been around very long before the sun rose. And the sun was debilitating to him. He was hindered by the light. He couldn't stand to be in it for very long, and neither could his forces. So he wasn't able to send great armies or minions to torment and abduct and potentially torture the men like he had the elves. So their early years were relatively peaceful. West, north, and south, children of men spread and wandered. And their joy was the joy of morning before the dew is dry, when every leaf is green. Tolkien tells us a lot about early men in the ways that they are similar to elves, and it's very interesting because it's pretty different from The Lord of the Rings. In the beginning, Elves and men are very similar. They're very similar to elves in strength and physicality, but elves are a little more beautiful and they are much wiser. Elves are immortal, so while their bodies will eventually stop aging, their minds and spirits will continue to age in the sense that they will continue to take in information. They will get wiser. They will learn from experience. And so they will be more skilled, better adapted. Again, wiser. Wiser is a word that comes up a lot. But in the beginning, when elves didn't have a lot of world experience, and by a lot, I mean still a couple thousand years, but that's not much in the grand scheme of things. In the beginning, their spirits were not used to the world, and Tolkien tells us that they burned bright. They were full of vibrancy and new life in the same way that men were. So there just weren't as many differences between the races at first. However, obviously the main difference is that men are mortal. They age and they die. They also can get injured more easily and heal a lot more slowly. The greatest unknown when it comes to men is what happens to them after they die. When an elf's body dies or is killed, or for whatever reason the spirit leaves the body, the spirit is stuck. It has to stay in the world. Typically, they will go to the halls of Mondos, which is kind of like a waiting room in Valinor, where they wait for the end of the world, and then whatever happens, happens. No one actually knows. But with men, it's different. When they die, their spirits go somewhere that is not within the world. No one knows, except Ilúvatar, the great creator himself. Maybe they go to a different world. Maybe they just disappear. No one knows. And that is the biggest difference. The interesting thing is that Tolkien, through Ilúvatar, describes this as a gift. It is a gift that they get to leave this world when they die. And while many men, and it will cause many problems in the future, look at mortality more as a curse that they don't get to live forever, it was always intended to be a sort of freedom that the elves do not have. The elves don't get the luxury of just passing on. Even in death, they are stuck. Not much is known about the early history of men, or in fact, the history of men really up until the Third Age, because the Silmarillion is primarily set around the time and the histories of the Eldar, of the history of the early elves. So the only times we really see men is when it pertains to their interactions and their relationships with elves. So although they do come up, especially more and more as the ages go on, we don't know all that much about them. So with that background on men, now we will finally go into the point where they have made their multi-generational trek across the continent and finally reach Beleriand, the western part of Middle-earth. And just a quick setup, feel free to watch my videos on who is in Beleriand and why they're there. Just a super quick rundown, there are essentially two groups and then many subgroups within those groups. There are the Sindar, the elves who have always been there. They traveled from the east, where they woke up, to the west, but then never made it to Valinor. Then there are the Noldor. These are the elves that went to Valinor, but stuff went down, a lot of stuff went down, and now they are in exile back in Middle-earth. So those are the two groups essentially, the Sindar and the Noldor, and now the men are going to come on the scene. The first elf to meet men, and one of the most important elves in early history, is Finrod Felagund. And Finrod is the eldest son of the youngest son of the first High King. Finrod is also beloved by pretty much everybody. He is just one of those elves that is not only graceful and beautiful and talented, they all are, well, yeah, no, they all are, but he's also kind. He's good. Finrod is just a good guy, and he is one that spends time with the more estranged family members, the sons of Feanor. And Finrod would spend time hunting with the eldest two, Maedhros and Maglor. and they would hunt in the forests of Beleriand, and this is in the southeast part of the west. And this is the area that is actually populated by the Lake Wendy. Yes, I'm throwing another name at you. The Lake Wendy are a group of elves that are pacifists. They are related to and descended from elves that were mostly killed off during the First Great War of Beleriand, where elves were attacked by orcs for the first time. And so these green elves, they do not fight, they don't like conflict, they actually don't even really like hunting. I can imagine they weren't super happy about the fact that people are hunting in their forests, but they love Finrod because everyone loves Finrod and he spent time with them and they sing together. Lake Wendy are great singers. But there came a time where Finrod was getting a little bored of just hunting and ruling his beautiful underground cavernous realm of Nargothrond. You know, there's only so much that one can see after thousands and thousands of years of being alive. So he starts to explore. And it just so happened that one day he was out kind of roaming around alone. It didn't really seem like there was anywhere that Finrod wasn't allowed to go. And on this particular day, he was north of Beleriand, and he happened to see lights and hear music. This was unusual because Finrod knew that the Lake Wendy did not light fires or sing after dark. And this was because they were afraid orcs would come down from the mountains and find them. Remember, the Lake Wendy are very traumatized from conflict and they hide. So he thought this was strange. As he got closer, Finrod realized that the language he was hearing wasn't Elvish, but it also wasn't Dwarven or Orc. So he did not know who was singing, but clearly they had some sort of language. So he got closer. This draws me back to the first time that the elves were discovered, when Orome, the mighty hunter, happened to stumble across the elves. It's kind of similar here. Finrod, who had been hunting in the area, just kind of so happens to stumble across the men, and he is intrigued. He sneaks down quietly into their camp, and there he beheld a strange people. He waited in the dark, a little creepy, waited in the dark trees until the men fell asleep, and then he snuck into their camp. He found a harp that had been put aside by the person who had been leading the singing, and he picked it up. And I'm guessing because music has always been a great unifier for the elves, Finrod decided that he would introduce himself to these new people by singing to them. So using this harp, he began to play beautiful melodies and he began to sing. Slowly the men awoke and they were just astounded by this sound. They didn't really know how to play good music, I guess you could say. Tolkien does tell us that it's a rude harp, by which I assume he means it's kind of archaic. So this was something completely new. And Finrod sang to them about the creation of the world and life in Aman and the beauty of Valinor. Despite the fact that they did not speak the same language, the music that Finrod sang was kind of transmitted into the minds of the men. They weren't able to understand the words, but they could picture what he was saying. At first, they thought he was one of the Valar. He was this beautiful, shining creature with eyes of light, and that's really what they assumed Valar were. But when he was done singing, Finrod actually stayed and explained to them just the state of the world, the ins and outs, and who's who. He stayed with them for a long time, teaching them what he knew. And he learned that when he had found them, they had been singing because they were grateful to be in the West at last. They thought they had come to a place of safety and joy and abundance, and they were just happy to be there. That's the song that had drawn Finrod to them. And the one who had been singing, primarily, was their leader, their chieftain, Bayor. Tolkien tells us that at first they were able to communicate because Finrod could read the minds of the men and he could pick up the things that the men wanted to say. So he could almost read the things they spoke through their minds in his own language. He could interpret their words that way. And then, because they had learned language from the Avari, which I mentioned earlier, shared a root language with all elves, they were soon able to communicate. I assume by this Tolkien means that Finrod was able to learn their language, because we know from many, many points in the book, Tolkien tells us that Quenya, the language of the High Elves, is very difficult to learn. So more likely Finrod was able to use his kind of understanding of their intention and then the root of their language to then learn whatever language it was that the men spoke. Once they were able to fully communicate and converse, that's when Finrod was able to learn as much as they knew about their situation. Finrod asked why they had been journeying west, but Beor didn't really know. As I mentioned, it took generations for them to make this journey, and the first reasons for traveling had become lost just over a long, long history. They did know that some sort of darkness, some sort of shadow had befallen them in the east, and this is what caused them to turn west. But they didn't really know what that shadow was, only that they needed to leave it behind, because in the west there would be light. Elves would later say, maybe they were just speculating, but elves would later say Morgoth had actually gone in person to the earliest men, that his spies had told them about the men, and that he had managed to sneak out of Angband during one of the nights and get to them. At this point, he had tried to either corrupt or destroy them, or both. He had done something to them that had left a kind of darkness and shadow on their spirits. And this actually was something that the elves could perceive, in the same way that a darkness or shadow or kind of a dark fate, you could say, was on the Noldor. Long story there, but they do have a dark fate on them. The men also had this kind of darkness to them, and that seemed to be whatever shadow it was that Beor mentioned from the past. Elves say that Morgoth had not been able to fully corrupt the hearts of men or to finalize whatever he had been scheming, because he was wary to be away from Angband for too long. At this point, Morgoth, who had started off as an immensely powerful, terrifying creature, both physically and mentally, was now relatively weak physically. He had given much of his power to his minions and kind of sent them out to do his bidding. So personally, he wasn't all that strong, and we know that the sun affected him badly. So it seems that whatever plan Morgoth had for the earliest men did not come to fruition completely, because he went back to Angband before it could be finished. He then left behind servants to assumably continue whatever it was, but they just weren't as powerful as he was. And so some men maybe escaped, maybe weren't fully under the influence, something that caused them to run basically from the east and seek out the light in the west. If only they knew that they were going to the very lands that Morgoth was trying to destroy, out of the frying pan and into the fire. But that was as much as Beor knew, and then later as much as the elves would speculate. From the time that Finrod spent with this first group of men, Beor became immensely loyal to him, and his people were thereafter completely devoted to the house of Finarfin. He became absolutely beloved, adored, respected. Like I said, Finrod has always been those things, but these men in particular, they latched on to the house of Finarfin, and Beor would serve Finrod faithfully for the rest of his life. One group that Beor's people actually had met in the past and that had a language kind of similar to theirs, and one group that he didn't really know. He just knew who led it, and that was about it. The only thing these groups really had in common was that they were all men, well, humans, there were women and children, and that they all wanted to come west. There were the Haladin, who were still up kind of north in the mountains that had yet to come across the mountain range into Beleriand. And there was another group ruled over by a man named Merach. And this group was the largest of the three groups of men. And because they were the largest, they moved the slowest. This group had actually set out before Bayors' people, but Bayors' ancestors had overtaken them in the journey west because the group was just too big, and so they moved very slowly. Now, it didn't take all that long of Finrod being with the men before the Green Elves, who inhabited these forests, learned about the men, and they went to Finrod and asked him to make them leave. They did not like anything new. They did not like anything that they did not trust. As I mentioned, they are still very wary of conflict and really just the unknown. They did not want these new beings to invite any kind of danger upon them. So Finrod, respecting the wishes of the Green Elves, told Beor to get up his people and to come with him further west. Finrod led these people over the river Gelion into the lands that were ruled by Amrad and Amras, the youngest sons of Feanor. The men set up camp in an area that was south of Nan Elmoth, which was a very dark patch of forest, and near Doriath. This area was named Estolad, meaning the encampment. After about a year had passed, with Finrod remaining with this group and acclimating them to the west, Finrod decided it was time for him to go home to Nargothrond. He, in fact, had a whole little kingdom to rule, and he needed to go back. But Beor, being fiercely loyal, decided that he wanted to go, and he begged Finrod to allow him to come back to Finrod's home. Finrod agreed, and as I said, Beor would go on to serve him for the rest of his mortal life. Eventually, he would pass down this position as kind of trusted human servant advisor to his son, Beron, not to be confused with Baron, who is going to come up later. This whole family is just B down the list. Now, not long after Finrod left Estolad with Beor, the next group of men arrived on the scene. Without Finrod there to speak to them and to welcome them, they came across the Green Elves first, as the first elves they met. And as mentioned, the Green Elves did not want them there. And so this group of men were kind of repelled away from Osiriand and went north, settling in the lands of Thargelion, which was ruled over by Caranthir. Lucky for them, Caranthir actually ignored them and just let them stay there. And this group was the Halidin. The year after that, Merach and his people came. And I say Merach, it could be Merach, but the CH always just makes me want to go Scottish, so I think it's Merach. They were a tall and warlike folk, marching in ordered companies, and the elves of Osiriand hid themselves and did not waylay them. Once again, conflict, very scary to the Lake Wendy. So the people of Merach were able to just waltz on in straight into the west, and they settled just south of Beor's people. And those two groups, the people of Beor and the people of Merach, became close friends. Many elves visited these men as soon as word got around that they were there. They were just curious and excited to see these new creatures. As I mentioned, they knew that men were coming, at least the Noldor did. And among those who visited often was Finrod. He would go back and make sure that, they were doing well, and he kept up their friendship. In Sindarin were named the Edain, but this name was only used to describe the men who had come into the west. The three groups, the Halidin, the people of Merach, and the people of Beor. Those who stayed in the east were not considered to be part of the Edain. Those who came into the west were considered to be elf friends. Next week, I'm going to go over the social and political landscape of all of Beleriand. So we're going to discuss Gondolin, Nargothrond, Doriath, the interactions between the men, the coming generations of men, and the elves, and we're going to set the scene for the next major event, which is the ruin of Beleriand. Also next week, or potentially the week after, depends on if my video editing software is nice to me this time, because it hasn't been, I will also be releasing a video on the founding and the early days of Gondolin, including the very, very intense and more than a little problematic story of what happens to Eredhel, the daughter of Fingolfin. I hope you will join me for those upcoming stories, and I appreciate you so much for watching this video. Please like, subscribe if you want to. Let me know what you think. Like I said, I really do read them. I do. It just takes me a long time to respond. I appreciate it nonetheless, whether you do or you don't. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week.